Well, good evening, folks. Welcome to the November edition of the Local History Guild. Um, I'm Mike Dyer. I'm the Curator of Maritime History here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and we have another really interesting program conversation this evening for sure. This is a funny one. This wasn't my idea, really. It was Stephen Davies' idea. Well, it wasn't really his idea. What happened was he sent me this email about a Chinese junk and that appears in Purrington and Russell's 1849 Grand Panorama of Whaling Voyage Around the World. And of course, I got very excited about that because it's this bizarre thing that appears in Purrington and Russell's panorama, and so I said, wow, in the course of conversation, so many interesting things came up about Hong Kong and the junk and Massachusetts connections to Hong Kong. So wrote to Stephen, and he seemed to think that it was a good idea maybe to have a conversation, and then contacted Karina Corrigan, who's a curator at the Peabody Essex Museum, who has a fantastic new show on photography in Hong Kong. So our speakers this evening are first up is Karina H. Corrigan, Associate Director of Collections in the H.A. Crosby Forbes, Curator of Asian Export Art at the Peabody Essex Museum up in Salem. Associate Director, she's responsible for spearheading research into the collection, enhancing access to the collection through increased documentation, digitization, and display, building the collection through acquisitions, all the stuff that great curators do. She has organized 10 changing exhibitions from the Peabody Essex Museum's notable collections, including Asia and Amsterdam, the culture of luxury in the Golden Age, co-organized with the Rijksmuseum, and right now, Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China, on display at the Peabody Essex Museum from September 24th to April 2nd, 2023. We have our marching orders for the winter. We go to Salem. And Stephen Davies. Stephen Davies lived in Hong Kong off and on from 1947 until 2022. He says that he was baptized on the quarterdeck of the battleship HMS Rodney in 1945 and has been hooked on maritime history ever since. He's taught at the University of Hong Kong from 1974 to 1989 and took a 3,200 country odyssey in his 11.8 meter sloop Fiddler's Green 2 with his partner Elaine Morgan. He was the first director of the Hong Kong Maritime Museum and a chief researcher there until 2013. He's been teaching since then, and has written this fantastic book, which I can recommend. I read it. You all should read it too. It's East Sails West, The Voyage of the Keying, 1846 to 1855. It's funny how this program came together. And I wanted to thank Karina and Stephen for taking time out of their busy schedules to have a chat about Hong Kong and Massachusetts and maritime history and all the good stuff that we're interested in. The title of the program is when local implies that that local history, in this particular instance, is starting in Hong Kong, for heaven's sakes. That's a long way away from southeastern Massachusetts. And as we know here in New Bedford and Fairhaven in this region, there's not a really strong connection compared to, say, the whaling connection or trade, with the Baltic and Europe and the West Indies. It's not quite as strong a connection, but we do have some important pieces in the collection and some important history. Gideon Nye of Fairhaven and the Hathaway family of Fairhaven and Warren Delano of Fairhaven. These people were actively engaged in the China trade, and Warren Delano and his family actually lived in Hong Kong after the first Opium War. But that sort of lays the groundwork for these presentations. Now, Karina is going to start us off. She's got some slides, and I'll turn it over to Karina, and she'll talk and give her presentation for a while, and then we'll move on to Mr. Davies.
Thanks, Michael. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. It's wonderful to be able to do this. One of the happy outcomes of COVID is that I think we've gotten used to doing these truly global conversations. And I hadn't even really thought about it until Michael was saying my title. And indeed, in my very job title is Massachusetts Ties to Hong Kong, in that Crosby Forbes, who was the founder of the Museum of the American China Trade in Milton, Massachusetts, and then ultimately the first curator of Asian export art at the Peabody Essex Museum, is a direct descendant of Robert Bennett Forbes, who was one of the great Massachusetts China traders. And weirdly, I had also forgotten about this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Warren Delano, but I think probably 20 years ago, my parents almost bought Warren Delano's house in Fairhaven, which I thought was going to be amazing for them to be living in a China trader's house. They ended up moving to Vermont, but I hope somebody wonderful is in that house now, because it's certainly, even though the South Shore is less directly connected in terms of active trade, you certainly have many, many China traders living there on the South Shore, including Warren Delano and others. Can you see my slides? So I wanted to talk just a little bit tonight about Massachusetts' direct ties with Hong Kong. And this is a view of Salem Harbor as it looks now, with a reconstruction of one of the many ships that sailed from Salem to China in the late 18th and early 19th century. And I don't have the actual number, but I know that even by 1814, there were 491 ships that had sailed from Massachusetts to China. So I'm anticipating it's more than 1,000 would have ultimately gone to China from Massachusetts between 1784, which was the first time that Americans could trade directly with China after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, throughout the 19th century. On the right are a pair of unfired clay figures, Chinese figures, that were brought back to Salem in 1803 by one of the founders of the Peabody Essex Museum. And of course, I wanted to show them because they're wonderful, but also just to emphasize that tea was the economic driver for all this trade. I mean, we think about porcelain, we think about lacquer, we think about silks, we think about other luxuries, but really tea is the reason everybody was traveling halfway around the world from Massachusetts. And initially, let's see, can I move forward? Oh, now, of course, see, I knew it was never going to work the way we'd hope. Let's see if I can do it this way. Yes. Initially, everybody is sailing here. This is a panoramic watercolor of Guangzhou, the port city of Canton. And all foreign trade with China happened in this port city from the mid-18th century until the First Opium War. And I hope you can make out these white buildings along the waterfront. These are Western style buildings where foreigners both lived and worked during their time in China. And this was an incredibly confined space, but also, to my mind, one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world in the early 19th century, because you have Chinese merchants. I'm just putting on a timer so I do not ramble on endlessly. You have Chinese merchants, you have merchants from all of the Western trading nations. After 1784, you have Americans, you have Parsi merchants, all congregated there, really to make enormous, truly enormous sums of money. And this trade continues really until the First Opium War. And this is a conflict that is primarily between Great Britain and China, but involves the Americans as well, over the illegal smuggling of opium into China. The British are extracting huge quantities of opium from India. In many respects, one could think of the British Empire in India as a giant opium factory. Americans are buying opium in Turkey, in Smyrna, or at Izmir. And it's illegal to be bringing opium to China, but people are doing it constantly and in vast quantities, principally because there wasn't all that much that we had that the Chinese wanted. And not that they necessarily wanted opium, but certainly there was a ready market for this. On the left is a watercolor of an opium poppy, and we have an opium pipe at the top. And down below is a painting by a Chinese artist of two ships at Linton Island, which was where the cargoes of opium coming into China would have been offloaded, kind of outside of the formal structure of trade, to begin the smuggling of opium into China. The outcome of the first Opium War is, of course, the ceding of Hong Kong to Great Britain. And here is an oil painting in Pem's collection. And I think essentially everything but the very last slide I'm going to show you is from Pem's collection. This is a very large oil painting done by a Chinese artist in oil on canvas of Hong Kong Harbor. And you can see the buildings that are just starting to creep up the peak, which is now completely covered in buildings. Another sort of consequence of the first Opium War is the opening of multiple treaty ports. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Guangzhou, which of course was already opened, but essentially foreigners have much greater access and ease of movement in Guangzhou at that point. As Michael mentioned, the show that's up at the Peabody Essex Museum right now is Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China. And most of the slides I'm going to show you next are photographs that are featured in that exhibition. The Peabody Essex Museum has an extraordinary collection of 19th century photographs from China, over 2,500 19th century photographs taken in China. And I think what is particularly unusual about Pem's collection is these are photographs that came into the collection as new photography in the 19th century, brought back by Massachusetts traders who were actively engaged in the trade. So in addition to them having this very illustrious provenance, we also have works of art related to many of these families. We have archival papers in the library that are related to them. So it's an incredibly rich, multifaceted archive that we're featuring in this exhibition. As Michael mentioned, it's up until April 2nd, and I'm not 100% sure Stephen's going to get here from the UK before April 2nd, but all of those of you who are on the South Shore, Halloween is over. We have gotten rid of October. The crazies are gone. So it is very safe to come to the North Shore, and I want to welcome you to come up at some point between now and April 2nd. Most of these photographs were in albums like the one you see on the left, which you can see is labeled Hong Kong Views. And here on the right is a beautiful photograph by John Thompson of Causeway Bay. Certainly these were collected as both documentation, but also souvenirs of people's time in China. Two more wonderful photographs, another by John Thompson of a Chinese junk on the left, and Milton Miller on the right of Aberdeen Dock. And the photograph on the right was brought back to Massachusetts by Augustine Hurd, the son of the elder Augustine Hurd, if that means anything to anybody. I also wanted to feature this photograph of the waterfront in Hong Kong. And at the very center of this photograph is the warehouse of Thomas Hunt and Company. Hunt was a Salem merchant who spent a lot of time in China and established initially a ship's chandlery in Whampoa, the deep water dock for foreign vessels coming to trade in Guangzhou. But he ultimately diversified and was also heavily invested in Hong Kong. So this wonderful view of Hong Kong Harbor. And then I wanted to take you onto Queens Road, one of the principal commercial streets in 19th century Hong Kong. And here you see a whole bunch of shop fronts advertising a lot of different types of establishments, a lot of photography studios. You can see here Floyd, the one who took this photograph. But if you look in the upper left, you see Namting, photographer and ship portrait painter. And we were really interested in the fact that there were a number of Chinese painters who then also became photographers, and they seem to largely no longer be advertising that they're painting anything else besides ship portraits, like the one you see here on the right. This is the ship Shirley, which was a Massachusetts vessel owned by Pickman Silsby and Company. And we literally have hundreds of large-scale oil paintings done by Chinese artists of Massachusetts ships in the Peabody Essex Museum's collections. I think a lot of people were having most subjects taken as photographs, but for these economic engines for their wealth, these huge ships that are transporting all of these luxury goods back to Massachusetts, they're still having large-scale oil paintings done by Chinese painters. And on the right is the steamship Hankow in Hong Kong Harbor, one of my favorite beautiful photographs in this exhibition. Queens Road was certainly this major epicenter for photographers and painters, but it was also an amazing street for lots of souvenir shops. And this is John Thompson's photograph of Walong and Kumwo's shop on Queens Road, selling a whole host of these elaborately carved ivory souvenirs. And you can make one-to-one comparisons between, you know, the ivory junk you see here and these ivory junks here, calling card cases down here, dice, dice shakers. I can't remember where those are. I think they're maybe up here in this photo. So really, all kinds of souvenirs available to you on these this busy street in Hong Kong. I also wanted to talk about the fact that the British occupation of Hong Kong was really largely for economic purposes, but there is also a missionary component to this. And the spread of Christianity was substantial in the 19th century, and that had a profound impact on the built landscape in Hong Kong. Here we see two of William Pryor Floyd's photographs of Christian churches in Hong Kong. And here is one of the many group business photos. This is sort of businessman central, and we have lots and lots of these group portraits of businessmen, most of them from Massachusetts. Obviously, we have a local Chinese, probably a comprador in the upper left, perhaps an Indian servant in the far right, and still curious about who this guy is. This is a photograph of Thomas Hunt and Company. I showed that warehouse at the center of the view of Hong Kong Harbor. And here, right here, is Thomas Hunt and Company at this, and his son, Thomas Franklin Hunt. And in fact, Thomas Franklin Hunt, this dashing young man, spent his earliest years in Whampoa, that deepwater harbor south of Guangzhou. And he is our first donor of photographs. He was largely self-educated, assembled a huge English language library on China, and donated both that and many photographs to what was then the Essex Institute, one of our founding institutions, at the very end of his life in the late 19th century. Thomas Hunt, his father, by the time this photograph had been taken, had already sold this business to other Massachusetts businessmen, including James B. Endicott. And I'm going to come back to him in just a sec. But I also want to talk about Augustin Hurd and Company, another rival firm. And here we see another one of these group business portraits with largely Massachusetts merchants, but also some of their local Chinese support system. Augustin Hurd had 4 sons, all of whom went into the business. And in fact, his namesake son is right here. And this on the right is, which may be familiar to some of you, the Heard House in Ipswich, Massachusetts, which is the historic house that talks about certainly Augustine Heard's life, but also features many works of art that he brought back from China. And lastly, and of course, the largest and most prominent American firm in Hong Kong was Russell and Company, which was established by Samuel Russell, who was a Connecticut merchant, but the vast majority of the employees of Russell and Company in the latter half of the 19th century were Massachusetts merchants. The view on the left is of Rose Hill, a house that Warren Delano, your very own Warren Delano, bought, I believe, in 1857. This is midway up the peak in Hong Kong. And this really was sort of the residence for many of the principal partners in Russell and Company in Hong Kong from the late 1950s, really until 1891 with the bankruptcy of the firm. The family you see here on the right is Elijah Huntington and his wife and 2 daughters. He was a partner in Russell and Company, and also Charles Alexander Tomes. This single man who talks about the day that he was invited to come up and live at Rose Hill, and kind of what a thrill that was to really have made it to be living at Rose Hill. And for anybody who is interested, his business papers are at the Massachusetts Historical Society and make for excellent reading. I quote him quite a lot in the catalog for Power and Perspective. The vast majority of photographs of that came back were taken by Western photographers. This is a very rare photograph by a Chinese photographer, Lai Afong, who was one of the leading photographers in Hong Kong in the second half of the 19th century. This is one of these group business portraits of Russell and Company. And actually, this guy in the center is William H. Forbes, and that was Warren Delano's son-in-law. Compradors, Chinese compradors are actually essential in terms of the work that all of these Massachusetts merchants are doing. The vast majority of them didn't speak Chinese, and certainly that hampered them significantly. Compradors are really the way that they're making so much of this business work. This is a group portrait of Cho Ping here in some very expensive furs. He was a comprador who worked very extensively with a lot of Massachusetts merchants, including those in Russell and Company. And I just wanted to end going back to this group portrait of Thomas Hunt and Company, but really to talk about James B. Endicott, who at this point, this is telling me to stop talking. I'm going to just talk for 2 more minutes. James B. Endicott, Massachusetts merchant who bought Thomas Hunt and Company from the namesake. And what I wanted to talk about is the fact that James B. Endicott lived in Hong Kong for many years. He entered into a long-term relationship with a Hong Kong woman, Ng Ah Kiew. They had 5 children. And after a number of years, Endicott ultimately went on to marry a British woman. And with his marriage, I think essentially their relationship dissolves. And interestingly, his 3 elder children with Ng Ah Kiew come with him. The 2 younger children stay with Ng Ah Kiew. And the photograph we're seeing on the right are 2 of the 3 children that stayed with him. His namesake, James B. Endicott, essentially Jr., H.B. Endicott, Henry, and his namesake, James B. Endicott. And so they are the biracial children of this Massachusetts merchant. H.B. Endicott would go on himself to marry a biracial woman in Hong Kong and have even more children with her, who would ultimately emigrate to the United States. The woman in the middle is not Ng Ah Kiew. We don't have any representation of her. This is a woman we believe to have been a companion of members of the Heard family. We're not entirely sure exactly who, but this painting descended with some slightly enigmatic provenance in the Herd family. And I wanted to end here just to be really emphasizing the complex and hybrid communities, both professional and personal, of these Massachusetts merchants who are literally living large portions of their lives halfway around the world in China. And of course, because we are talking about this amazing, huge panorama in the New Bedford Whaling Museum's collections, I wanted to end with this, the only image not in PEM's collection. This is a spectacular panorama taken by Felice Beato that's in the collections of MoMA. This is in the show right now at PEM, and this is showing a photograph kind of, I think, halfway up the peak, taken in 1860 when Beato was embedded with the British troops during the Second Opium War. And all of those boats you see in the harbor are British naval vessels who are preparing for the campaign north to Beijing that would ultimately result in the end of the Second Opium War. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Stephen.
Well, that was a fantastic introduction, Karina. Stephen, we're going to have to unmute yourself there so we can hear you. Go ahead and yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so I'm completely unprepared. I hadn't realized that I could have done a PowerPoint because Karina's is just fantastic, and there's no way I can compete with that. I just gathered together in my tiny head a bunch of very literal, strict Massachusetts links that I knew of as a result of working on Hong Kong and in Hong Kong and its maritime contexts, including the keying, which I'll come back to. But for example, I mean, there is obviously the Forbes, Sturgis, Handelside, Russell and Company family, which few people realize there's actually a street named after them in Hong Kong called Forbes Street in the very western part of Hong Kong Island, because in 1883, William Howard Ford and a few others put the money together to create a rope factory. And when the company went bankrupt in 1891, a couple of its employees went off on their own, Schuon and Tomes, and they founded Schuon, Tomes and Company, which carried on in Hong Kong successfully until about the 1960s. And they actually took the rope company to a major international producer of natural fiber ropes, Manila rope and jute rope being the two marks of quality of good ship's ropes during the period of natural fiber, but being typically British run firms, when artificial fiber took over, they kind of weren't up there with the pace, and the company went out of business. My favorite story, which is a Massachusetts connection, is a US Navy officer called Francis Matthew Green, who arrived in 1882 in the USS Pallas, which was a kind of rather hokey tug that, like all things to do with hydrographic surveying, they get the cast-offs of the fleet. But the Pallas was part of a global US Navy project to try and pin down the longitudes of the major ports around the world, which in the 1880s were not well known. They were good to within maybe half a mile, but not much better than that. And Green and his compadres in the Naval Observatory had worked out that the new submarine telegraph, the way the world first got wired, could be used to pinpoint longitudes using simple physics. And they went around the world in a couple of US Navy vessels between 1875 or 6, I think, when it first began, and 1883 when it finished, pinning down longitudes. They arrived in Hong Kong in 1882. They spent something like 5 months in Hong Kong, going around to Manila, down to Vietnam, and pinning down various longitudes, including Hong Kong's. And that actually was the first time that Hong Kong had a precisely measured longitude. And what I really like is that although F.M. Green, who is buried in a cemetery in Boston, along with his wife, actually his two wives, because he married successively two sisters. Although he actually built a little thing called Palos Pier, which is a a pedestal on which he put his scientific instruments. They were all related to a picture that Karina showed by John Thompson, which is the tower of St. John's Cathedral, Hong Kong, which was at that time the mark of longitude. That was the center of Hong Kong. That's where Hong Kong was going to be. And a year later, the official observatory was founded and the longitude was shifted, but using Green's measurement to the observatory position. The Hong Kong Maritime Museum has, and I don't have a picture, unfortunately, because I hadn't prepared for it. It's got two rather interesting wooden objects that look like two sides of a triptych. And on them are reverse glass paintings of a ship from Boston called the Columbia Rediviva, which is the first ever American ship to circumnavigate the world. And that links in to a bunch of Hong Kong stories to do with a man called John Kendrick, another Bostonian, who was in a ship called the Lady Washington, which made the first American visit to Japan, completely illegal. He was then subsequently killed by a British salute. They'd forgotten they'd loaded the gun in Hawaii. But he really is the guy who put Hong Kong on the map, because his is the first detailed narrative description of an anchorage in Hong Kong and how to get there, which was Aberdeen Harbour on the west coast of Hong Kong. What I really love about that story is that the British then conspired over about as far as I can work out, over about a 10 or 15 year period to shift Kendrick's description of how to find Aberdeen into a description of how to find another bay altogether, because I think they didn't want anybody else to know that there was this superb harbour where you could careen your vessel, so tip it over on its side in shallow water and clean the bottom, and get supplies and get replacement spars and much else besides. I've also done some work on the Hong Kong Cemetery, which has, in particular in respect of the US Navy, and it has 12 maritime New Englanders' graves. Most of them are people who were on board US Navy ships, but one of them is directly related to New Bedford, which is a man called Joseph Bailey of the whaler Champion, because in the 1850s, there were a number, not a large number, but a number of New England whaling vessels, which did actually call in Hong Kong, to the point that the French consulate in Guangzhou wrote a stiffish note to Paris saying, look, we need representation in Hong Kong because our chaps are deserting their ships in Hong Kong, signing aboard American whalers and disappearing. And we need to be able to control this. Joseph Bailey may have had nothing to do with it because he died in Hong Kong. And
let me interrupt you quickly here, Stephen. I have the Champion logbook open to the page where Bailey died in Hong Kong right here on my desk. So that's what this is.
Yeah.
This is the Champion.
Yeah, and brilliantly, you've got it online. So I could actually read it right in the guy's writing. What else? Talking about the Champion and Bailey and whalers and desertions, that leads us straight in to another Bostonian who has a brother who was a ship skipper, whose house is a landmark on historical walks around New Bedford, the octagonal house, because George Lewis Haskell, who could apparently speak fluent French, his early life is a bit obscure, he was the first French consular representative in Hong Kong, who was appointed in 1843. In 1850-something, he left Hong Kong for Singapore, and he was buried in the cemetery in Fort Canning in Singapore. Sadly, that's now been destroyed, but until the 1920s, his grave could be found. Interesting that an American should be the first French consular representative, and because he could speak good French. He worked for Thomas H. Bush, which is another Massachusetts chap from Taunton, Bristol County, who founded his own company. He'd arrived working for another company, another Massachusetts company in Whampoa, then moved down to Hong Kong, founded Bush and Company, and he became the first ever US consul. Well, did he? Because there's a little something from rather earlier, the 1840s, and I'm going to see if I can get this onto the screen, where
This is fascinating, folks, isn't it? There are local, this is like local history stuff that Stephen's talking about here. These are local guys.
So this is a local guy. Here it is. Now, see if I can do a screen share of this. Oh, hang on, I can't do that. Wait, stop. I've got to go back to Zoom and do screen share. Oh my God, this is so complex. I'll forget it. So I'm going to go back to what I was talking about because this is too complicated for me to do. I wasn't prepared, but there is a fellow called Thomas Westbrook Waldron. Now, he's not a Massachusetts guy. He came from Dover, New Hampshire, so kind of next door-ish, because it's just over the border from Massachusetts. And he actually was the first official US representative and probably consul in Hong Kong. He was on the civilian side of the US Navy. The US Navy at that time was divided into two bits. There were the guys who ran the ships, but they also had people like secretaries on board the ships. Waldron had been the secretary in the Wilkes expedition. So he was a US Navy employee. He's put into Hong Kong to be their first representative. And as a result, he creates the first US Navy presence in Hong Kong in 1843, when he opens a storehouse down in the western end of Hong Kong, which becomes, in effect, the first US consular presence in Hong Kong. Waldron, in the very same year, goes across to Macau to extend US presence to there, where sadly he catches malaria and dies. And then there's a bit of a hiatus before Frederick Thomas Bush, founder of Bush and Company from Taunton, Bristol County, becomes the first US consul. And then Michael and I, just to finish it off, before I come back to the keying, Michael and I talked about, in the New Bedford Whaling Museum's collection, there are two charts which are a product of Hong Kong's ingenious habits of providing copies of stuff that people need. It's still going on in Shenzhen. There's a village in Shenzhen which copies paintings. If you want them, any old painting you like, they'll copy it. They'll also make paintings for you, originals. Well, the guys who were Carina's ship portraitists from Hong Kong had worked out that there was demand for other things, including charts. The Brits were the major producers of charts at this time. But charts were expensive and they were quite hard to come by. There wasn't a good chart supply system set up by the 1850s, 1860s. So Hong Kong's feisty entrepreneurial artists working on the atelier system, they've always got very, very able apprentice artists who can do stuff. They said, fine, we'll get hold of a copy. How they got hold of the copy, I don't know. Maybe they borrowed it from some willing captain or paid him a fee, or maybe they bought their own copy. I've written yachting pilots, and believe me, it's still going on in Asia. They take our yachting pilot, they make a photocopy, and they sell it. Well, that's what they were doing. They bought charts by Norrie, charts by Walker, and they would make these incredibly faithful copies. If you look at them without any critical attention, you think, oh my golly, they've got a chart, a Norrie chart, or whatever it might be.
You can't tell that it's not.
Until you look really closely and you suddenly notice there are little spelling errors, because this guy can't read English. Indeed, he probably can't read Chinese. As Carina will tell you, a lot of the China trade artists who are painting stuff in Guangzhou, and they paint a sign, they're just copying. They can't read what they're painting, and sometimes they make a mistake. You'll find there's a stroke error in a character, because the whole Chinese printing system worked off woodblock printing. And none of the guys who carved wood blocks could read what they were carving. They were just carvers. They were not literate. So these guys could be set to copy, and they do it perfectly. And my favorite Hong Kong story about this is a street not far from Rose Hill, the Forbes house on Cane Road. Just a little bit below Cane Road, there's a street called Mosque Street, and quite close to it, there's a place that up until sometime in the 1950s was called Alexander Terrace. The Hong Kong government, in its wisdom, used prisoners to paint street signs. But Chinese people, when they read stuff from right to left. And a prisoner was sent to copy Alexander Terrace, the Alexander he was sent to copy. So he did, but he didn't speak any English, so he just copied down what he read. So Hong Kong still has a place, you can go look on Google, called Red Naxalar Terrace. And that's its official name. That's my links.
You know, our whaling fleet, you brought up Joseph Bailey. We have some paintings of whalers, in the museum collection, and I was just sort of curious, about when whalers started turning up in Hong Kong, and it appears that, as far as I can tell, the earliest Yankee whaler to turn up in Hong Kong was the David Paddock of Nantucket, about 1848. But an interesting fact is that that's around the same period that that American whaling voyages are penetrating the Sea of Okhotsk into Siberia, and so voyages to the Indian Ocean and then right whaling voyages to Siberia would pass through waters of the East Indies and South China Sea and into the Sea of Japan, where there was also whaling, and so this whole confluence of the opening of Hong Kong, the opening of the whaling grounds in Siberia, also had a great deal of influence on American whalers turning up in Japan as well, which was a no-no. The Hong Kong connection is actually related more to Siberia actually than it is to anything else.
Was it a Massachusetts whaler, the Lagoda, which was wrecked, and 16 guys were arrested and bunged in clink in Yedo, and that was because they are fetched up in Hong Kong.
They weren't wrecked. They ran away. They deserted. They were deserters. Those guys.
Oh, they were deserters.
They were bad guys. None of those were not nice guys. Those guys, like sort of to a man. But they were Americans, and so they needed to be treated like
But I mean, it was the proximate cause of the Perry exhibition later to open up Japan. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So, I found your book, you really, I thought really got to a number of really important things, in the story. And I think I got it right. I'm not sure. But that there was more to the Keeling story than what I had initially thought. I initially thought that it was kind of a spectacle. Isn't this an exotic curiosity from the other side of the world? Let's go look at the exotic curiosity. But I get the sense from your scholarship and your ideas that there may have been international relations involved in this story as well, or at the very least, some sort of a celebration of the acquisition of Hong Kong or something like that.
Well, more a vindication. I think Charles Kellett, and it's quite interesting, I didn't know this, I just speculated the book, and I've discovered a heap, typical, every author's penalty. You write a book, and then you discover all the stuff that you should have known before you wrote it. But then if you tried to find that stuff out, you'd never have written it. Chicken and egg. Anyway, Charles Kellett was an opium skipper. He started his life as a boy seaman working for the Falmouth Packets, which were running packet services to the West Indies and the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, for the British Post Office, or what was the forerunner of the British Post Office. He then gets a job as a second mate on an opium clipper called the Psyche and sails out to Hong Kong. He obviously he boards in Liverpool and the ship is being delivered to Denton Company. He becomes a Denton Company employee. And Denton Company are one of the big opium runners for the Brits. He then moves up, gets to be chief mate and later master of the brig called Curator. He then is a mate, chief mate on the Emily, Lady Emily, and he fetches up being the skipper of his last opium clipper. He obviously made enough money to become an investor in the Keying voyage. One of the real puzzles is, where does the money come from? Clearly, Charles Kellett had made money running opium. All of the investors, as far as I can work out, in the Keying were people with fingers in the opium trade. And so one significant part of the Keying project was to whitewash, in some respects, the British activities in the Far East. And at the same time, and I say this in the book, and I think it's fair, in contradistinction to Nathan Dunn's exhibition, which was very much a celebration of Chinese culture, I think the Keying voyage was, at least in part, to diminish it. It was not, I think, wholly benignly meant. It was produced as a rare e-show. I mean, it's interesting that when the Keying got to New York, who was one of the people who really leapt on what it represented? It was P.T. Barnum. Right. And P.T. Barnum had a rival show going. He got some kind of mock-up of the Keying, and he ran a P.T. Barnum show. But at the same time, whilst the Westerners are not covering themselves in glory, Samuel Wells Williams, who's back on leave in New York, he becomes the big champion of the Keying's crew, who I don't think were telling the truth, but they had some justification, because the voyage had proved that junks actually, they don't sail brilliantly. They don't sail any better than a not very well run Western square rigger. They don't beat any close to the wind. They have they were not coppered, so they had a much dirtier bottom. The Keying took an age, and it was heading for Britain and couldn't make it. It could not get round the Azores High, which requires you to haul your wind and really stonk north just to the westward of the Azores High, pick up the westerlies and run into the chops of the channel. Keying couldn't make it. It was actually making for Charleston, North Carolina, and they met an American brig on the way who said, guys, that's not a good idea. Don't go there. And so they hauled their wind and they made into New York. It wasn't intended. And when they got there, the poor old Chinese crew, and nobody knows exactly how many there were. The newspapers in New York say there were 40. The newspapers in Hong Kong say maybe there were 30. Nobody's ever counted. And 20 plus of them sued the skipper for their wages and their passage back to Hong Kong. And they won. The New York court found in their favor. So the Keying, when it was sailing past New England, was really, really short-handed. In fact, very much so. Because after I'd written the damn book, I found a 1933 copy of the Rhode Island Historical Society Journal. I mean, this is a fairly obscure publication, and I stumbled over it. And they had an article on the Keying coming through Long Island Sound. And my golly, it calls in Newport, it gets up to Providence, it goes down to Falls River, and that's when it's towed around by the R.B. Forbes.
They went to Fall River?
Buzzards Bay.
They went to Fall River?
They went to Fall River, yeah. They were towed.
That's a long tow up the Taunton River.
Yeah, they were towed up to Fall River.
Wow.
They were towed from Newport up to Providence by the Perry, which is a paddle tug, then towed by the Perry down to Fall River, and then the
Wow.
RB Forbes picked up the tow
Huh.
and towed them all around to Boston.
Huh.
Uh,
That must have been where Purrington and Russell either saw it or heard about it from some passing whaler, inbound. But I was, that one of Karina's photos was really pretty fantastic. The one of the deck of the junk, because in the description of of the crossing of the Atlantic, you wrote that there was 9-inch cables that snapped on the rudder cables were 9 inches. I mean, look, this back there on the back left, that's about a 9-inch cable.
Yeah.
Back there. Yeah.
And there were 10 guys on each side because they were gun tackles. Can you imagine steering that way? It's probably a 3-part tackle. So you've got 10 guys holding on. They got to haul in 3 meters to move the tiller head 1 meter. And then as soon as they've done that, the guys on the other side would go to pull in their stretch, and they're steering downwind. Almost all junks carried a spare rudder. They had to. The rudder was a kind of naval architectural disaster area. It had incredibly weak fastenings, and it was subject to huge stresses. Even though the Cantonese rudders were fenestrated, they had little diamond holes through them to try and reduce the pressure differential between the two sides, they were still subject to huge forces. And the Keying lost its rudder in mid-Atlantic. And its mate, plus a couple of the Chinese guys, went over the side. This is in February in mid-Atlantic. They go over the side for about 2 hours to reattach stuff. I mean, holy mother, those were tough cookies. I simply cannot imagine what that must have been like.
And yet, what was the alternative?
There was none. I mean, that's the amazing thing about being a seaman in those days. I mean, Richard Henry Dyer, I mean, they're up there doing stuff off Cape Horn when it's hailing and sleeting and there's ice on the yards. As Karina says, what else do you do?
But, Stephen, that's funny that you say that about the diamond. I'm going to share my screen again. Where are we? Looking at, okay, let's see, where am I going? Looking at, here, that, can you just make it out here?
Yeah.
So those are maybe I just thought those were decorative, but those are actually comparable to the kinds of piercings that you'd find on a rudder?
Yeah. It's mainly Cantonese. The local story is that a monk, all of these, the blades of rudders were made from pine planks, butt joined and held together by the horizontals at top and bottom. And with pine planks, pine is a very knotty timber, and the knots will pop out. Some monk, so the story goes, sailing on one of the junks, noticed that it's actually improved the handling characteristics. So somebody picks up on that, and then they make it a design feature, and they cut these diamond holes to reduce the pressure differential, but it doesn't actually reduce the effective performance of the rudder.
Interesting.
But reduces the stresses, which really did need to be reduced. Because those rudders, if you look at the size of the Keying's rudder, it's enormous. It stretches 12 feet down below the bottom of the keel. So the whole rudder and rudder post assembly is about 30 feet, 35 feet high. It weighed 6 tons. Think of that.
And if you get the book, there's lots of great images of the Keying in there that you can study them and enjoy them. And do you have a catalog, Karina? Are you going to have a catalog?
I do actually. I showed the cover of it. Power and Perspective. Yes, it's a big catalog. Lots and lots of Massachusetts history in it.
You don't happen to have a copy right there that you could hold up, do you?
I'll show you the cover. Here, wait a minute. I'll share my screen a third time.
If there's one good
close
thing
to the end.
Local History Guild
No.
is we talk about books.
There.
Books.
There it is.
That's the cover of the book.
How many pages?
340.
Wow.
Wow.
Big book,
This is major.
big book.
That weighs over 2 kilograms, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Almost a keying rudder. Yeah.
Happily not. Happily not that
Well,
heavy.
I don't actually see any questions in the chat, and we're just about sort of at the end of our time here. Well, we could. I mean, I get the sense that this could go on for a while. There's quite a lot to talk about. As far as, I mean, just for instance, just for the one small point, we had a pair of portraits here that were supposed to have been painted by Hing Hua in Hong Kong, of a whaling master and his wife and another woman, but that neither of those people ever went anywhere near Hong Kong. But apparently this other woman who was a Tabor had a relative who supposedly ran a hotel in Hong Kong. His name was George Tabor, and I want to get to the bottom of this, so I wasn't sure how to do it. So I started looking for Hong Kong directories, and sure enough, there are some. So just sort of digitized. That there's the Hong Kong directory for 1850 is digitized, and it's in English, and it's like a city directory, like any other city directory. And so there are resources out there, for to our local history audience. If there are the same kind of resources, like the New Bedford city directories, and ships registers and all those sorts of things that we use to go about and do our daily business. There are similar resources out there for the rest of the world too.
Yeah, I mean, that Hong Kong directory led straight into a very long publication that came out of Hong Kong from after the Hong Kong directory from the 1860s through until 1941, which was the Chronicle and Directory for China, Japan, Korea, and then it kept on adding places until by the end of its publication period, it was covering the entirety of East and Southeast Asia, and it listed every European who had any kind of job above, let's say, sergeant level. And you can find them on the Hathi Trust website. Some of them are on Google, on Internet Archive, but it's a phenomenal resource.
Internet Archive is a pretty great place, pretty great site for stuff.
One of the things that was really challenging for us with the photography project is we had certainly been doing preliminary work before that, but we really started the project in earnest in the summer of 2019 and had been intending to do all kinds of primary source research in lots and lots of archives. That then was completely impossible because of COVID. And so Stephen, as you say, like the archive that you absolutely need shows up. And I will say, I don't think the Rhode Island Historical Society Journal is an obscure journal. It's a very important journal. But it was amazing what we were able to access via the internet, even though the vast majority of the book was written while we were in lockdown in our houses.
Yeah, I mean, just to show what the internet can do, for many, many years, people have known that the first purpose-designed and built lighthouse in China was built on Fisher Island, Xiu, in the Penghu Islands, sometime in the 18th century. And it wasn't pulled down until 1875. And I thought to myself, yeah, there has to be a photograph. 1875, that's 15 years after that first French consul fellow was taking photographs in Macau and Guangzhou. So there's got to be one. And I went looking. And internet searching does require a certain level of patience. And it was on the 19th page of a Google search that I suddenly spotted an image that I thought, hey, that looks good. So I clicked on it and it came up. And I recognized that it was the London Royal Geographical Society's library. And so I quickly took a screen grab because I'm a natural pirate and put it away in memory and wrote to the RGF saying, hey, look, I've found this. Have you got it? And they said, how can you possibly have found it? We have never, ever made a digital copy, leave alone put it on the web. So this obviously must have been a trial thing. But then they fessed up and said, well, we actually do have this photograph that has been ascribed to Japan. And it turns out it was by Lai Arfong, who did a trip up through Taiwan in 1875. His first port of call had been Penghu, and they were just beginning to pull it down. You can actually see the beginning of the demolition in the photograph. And here's this brilliant photograph of the only ever purpose-built Chinese lighthouse that anybody's ever recorded. It's fabulous. And that's one of the real fun things about internet researching. You can find stuff you wouldn't even have dreamed of.
Although the frustrating thing is then as more and more is added to the Internet Archive, you have to continually keep redoing the searches because of course more is continuously available. So you can't just assume you've done the search.
Exactly so. Michael showed the pics in East Sales West, and in the book, in an appendix, I've got an appendix on all the images of the key, and I thought I'd found them all, 13. I've now found 21.
Volume 2.
No, it'll never get into it. There'll never be a second edition. Sadly, that's one of the gritty truths.
With documenting scrimshaw images all the time, just when you think that you've seen every image of a Maori chief, there are more images of Maori chiefs out there.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Karina and Stephen, thank you very much for taking your time to join the Local History Guild and share your knowledge and expertise and your great scholarship and your great exhibitions and with us and our audience. I greatly appreciate it, and it's nice meeting you both. And
lovely to be with you.
Pleasure for me too.
This is we have to thank, I can't forget, I often forget this, but I can't forget to publicly thank Jocelyn Nunes. She's she's been doing this for years now, and she makes it happen, and it makes my job a lot easier. And it makes
show yourself, Jocelyn.
Yeah, show yourself.
There she is.
Yeah, there she is. She kept me very well informed.
Thank you.
I got a reminder every 3 days.
Don't
forget.
Well, I'm glad that I could offer that for you. And Mike, thanks. You always do make sure to mention me, and it's deeply appreciated.
So this is the awkward part of the evening where I have to, click the leave button, and it's just like it just ends. It's like you have to say goodbye, and then you hit leave, and we're done. So again, thank you, and I hope.
Good night, everybody. Come visit us in Salem.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
And one day I'll get over there.